Welcome back, folks. This is Lawrence Patiers giving you another friendly lecture on false memories. This part will be about false memory theory, which is a little bit of a misnomer because only the most basic of theories in psychology I would call theories. The higher level explanations I would call frameworks, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. I really hope you enjoy this introduction to theory. It should set you up well for the research that we're going to talk about in the next section. Now, this lecture is without my video so that I and you can focus on the meaning of what we're talking about. Let's see if that works, and please give me some feedback on which videos were your favorites, and then we'll take that into account later. Before we get on to some of the higher level frameworks or theories, let's first talk about some foundational theories that I think you need to understand if you want to fully understand how to think from first principles about a case. So first, let's just talk about the underlying theory of psychology. Some people say there is no theory underlying psychology, which is a problem. I disagree. The theory of evolution by natural selection and its extension to say that just does not only apply to phenotype, but it also applies to mental processes. So mental processes and abilities are under the pressures of natural selection too. Of course, that was Darwin's work, 1859, and Dawkins did a very good update of Darwin's work in 1976, and I would say if you want to be a psychology intellectual, you probably would need to read Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, to be able to ground yourself in what is possible in psychology. Another foundational theory, this time in the area of memory, is the discovery of long-term potentiation. This is the basic theory that memory is stored in the synapses and the strength of the synapses between neurons. This came from an old idea from Donald Hebb. It's called Hebbian memory. Bliss and Lomo were the people who kind of discovered something very important about that. They called it long-term potentiation. So memory is stored in the synapses. We're pretty sure of this, but not completely sure. These are fairly good, well-supported theories so far. Then there's another important theory called consolidation theory. Some people might think of Magore's theory here that he talked about in a science paper in 2000. They might call that the standard consolidation theory, and that goes this way. It's the idea that the neocortex is crucial for storing fully consolidated memories. The idea is also that memory takes time to consolidate, so it can take as much as a week to consolidate a memory. So you see and you have an experience, and that is not fully solidified in your brain until about a week later or sometimes longer. And we get this idea from brain damage patients. We get it from temporary amnesia. When they have a head injury, they lose memories for a couple of weeks just before the injury. And there's some other evidence, for example, Magore himself, Jim Magore, somebody who I've worked with actually, he did experiments with rodents where he would inject them after their learning period with an excitatory neurotransmitter or an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And he found that there was a long period after learning that was important for consolidation. The other part of consolidation theory, the standard consolidation theory, is that the hippocampus plays only a temporary role of turning short-term memories into long-term memories, and then it's stored in the neocortex. Now, there's been some advances since then. I think I understand most of the consolidation theory by Magore. I agree with most of it, I should say. But there's some new evidence from reconsolidation theories, also called multiple trace theory, that just tweaks consolidation theory a little bit. So multiple trace theory or reconsolidation theory is the idea that only semantic memories are entirely in the neocortex. In other words, only knowledge-type memories, like capital of England, for example, and the capital of a given state in the United States, right? So that's knowledge, memory. The idea is that only that is stored entirely in the neocortex. And the idea is in multiple trace theory that episodic memory continually relies on the hippocampus every time you recall something, as well as every time you consolidate something, so that every time you remember something, new traces are being created with each retrieval, and then you can strengthen that trace if you retrieve things quite often. This goes hand in hand with the testing effect, which is the finding in memory that if you test yourself, you strengthen the memory. So these are some of the foundational theories that memory distortion researchers need to know to ground them in lower level theory, so that when we're dealing with the theories that I'm going to talk to you about, we use these grounding theories as well. So the first framework I would like to talk about is the idea of spreading activation, and there are some findings that confirm this. The idea is that concepts are stored in the brain in such a way that if you trigger one of them, it activates another one, and that activation spreads through the brain, and it activates concepts that are very close to the concept you've activated very much, and more distant concepts are activated just a little bit. For example, if you say to somebody the word fire engine, the theory is that that will not only activate this node in the brain for fire engine, it will also activate ambulance quite strongly, activate the concept of fire very strongly too, and it will even very weakly activate the concept of roses, and even more weakly the concept of clouds. So the idea is when you trigger a semantic category, it spreads throughout the brain to trigger other semantic categories. Now this does become important when you're thinking about how certain types of false memories occur. Right? So for example, if you give people a word list that constantly activates a word that is not actually in the list, then this theory of spreading activation will explain how the constant association with a word that is not there leads to the false memory of hearing that word. And those word lists in false memory research are called the DRM word lists that we'll get to this week. Now, I don't think this theory is the be-all and end-all of theories. I think it's been adapted nicely since then, but the basics are still very useful and still true for the most part. Another important theory in false memory research is actually not called a theory, because they were modest enough to understand that at this level of analysis we're dealing with frameworks more than theories. So it's called the source monitoring framework. So this focuses on how well we monitor where the source of information came from, right? So if I were to ask you to distinguish between something you dreamed 2 years ago and something that you did 2 years ago, you trying to distinguish between those two sources is source monitoring. So very often we do this correctly. For example, when we see a film of the Terminator or something, when a few years later, when we think about, oh, was there really a Terminator, or did I just imagine that, or did I see that in a film, we quite accurately say the source of that information came from a film, right? But sometimes it's more difficult to distinguish between what you had imagined in the past and what you did in the past. And there's been quite a lot of research that has backed that up, such as imagination inflation research that we'll get to this week, such as the research that Marcia Johnson did herself on reality monitoring and source monitoring research as well, which was the basis of this paper in 1993. This is one of the most used theories in the false memory researchers that I know. It's kind of our favorite framework to use because it works very well. So if we're working on a legal case, for example, when somebody uses hypnosis to help somebody imagine something that could have happened, and they use hypnosis week after week after week to try and remember something that they did not know, and they use imagination, very vivid imagination, week after week after week, and they come to believe something did happen when it was in fact their imagination, we would understand that from the source monitoring framework. In other words, we would say that it is possible that the person now is misremembering their imaginings in hypnosis when they're recalling something, and in fact it did not happen, and the witness is incorrectly attributing their knowledge to a real event rather than their imaginations within hypnosis. So it's a very powerful framework. It's a little bit loose, so it's a high level framework, so you have to use other theories that are underneath it to use it properly. So you have to, for example, understand the decay curve that Ebbinghaus discovered about memory. You use that theory, you use consolidation theory, reconsolidation theory in combination with source monitoring framework. Now, this theory was preceded by more than 10 years of research on reality monitoring, and then it was just tweaked a little bit, and source monitoring is like a subset of reality monitoring. The idea that we keep track of what is real and what is not, the difference between dreams and real life and imagination and real life, and we're not always perfect at doing that. And this research is also backed up by research that gets some people to do a task in lab, and then some people to just imagine doing a task, and then you mix up what people do. Some people imagine some things and do other things in lab, and then a few weeks later you test them on what they did and what they imagined, and they often get mixed up between what they did in lab and what they imagined in lab. And that was researched by Goff and Rodiger in 1998, and the paper was called Imagination Inflation for Action Events. So there's been quite a lot of good work on this. Another theory in false memory is called fuzzy trace theory. Now, this explains the same phenomena as source monitoring, but it explains it in a different way. Fuzzy trace theory says that people have two types of mental representation of a past event. So you memorize two different traces. One is called the verbatim trace, and the other one is called the gist trace. The gist traces are fuzzy representations of a past event, right? So it's kind of just the gist of what happened. And the verbatim trace is the details of the past event, the more exact details. And the idea is you have two separate systems. One stores the gist and one stores the verbatim. And when you recall it later, you might just be relying on the gist because verbatim might have faded away, or you might recall the gist because it's easier to deal with than all the details. So that gives you an idea of what might happen in false memories, right? So according to this theory, you see an event, forget a lot of the details, but some of the gist remains, so that when you come to recall the event many years later, you might just take the gist and then fill in false details, So it does help to explain some false memory phenomenon. And there are other theories that kind of combine different theories. Associative monitoring, for example, by Rodiger and colleagues, combined the spreading activation theory that we talked about earlier with source monitoring theory, and that's a fairly good idea to combine those two. So this is something that you can look at as a kind of another theory. And of course, there are more modern articles to cite in all of these areas, actually. It hasn't been resolved which is the best theory. I use a combination of them. And here in this lecture, I've been citing the seminal papers, but since then there's been many papers on this topic. For example, in 2019, my colleague Henry Otgar wrote a piece about associative monitoring as well. And finally, let's sum up the theories we talked about today. At the first level, on the grand, broad level, we have one theory underlying the whole of psychology, that's evolution. That applies to mental processes, it applies to memory as well. A little bit down the scale, in terms of broadness, we have what I would call solid memory underlying theories, such as long-term potentiation, consolidation, reconsolidation, spreading activation. And what I would call the top level of frameworks are source monitoring and fuzzy trace. Now, I wouldn't call those theories. They're more loose frameworks than theories, but they have to be loose frameworks because we're dealing with very complex behavior. That's the way I think about theories in this area. Hope that's been helpful for you. And I look forward to talking to you again about the empirical side of false memories next.